Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, Dr. Larry Jacobs joins us to talk about the transition from campaigning to governing. Also, we'll take a look at the large agricultural mergers impacting today's farmers. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. The election season must now transition into a time of governance, and newly elected officials with views across the political spectrum will be tasked to find common ground to improve the welfare of the country and the state. Joining me in the studio to reflect on the election season and to look into the future of governing is Dr. Larry Jacobs of the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now that the campaign is over, is it going to be difficult for those newly elected and re-elected officials to make the transition from the campaign trail and the rhetoric of the campaign trail to policy making and governing?
Yes. Next question.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah. No, I think it's very difficult. We've got a political system now that is quite tribal. Mm-hmm. We've got the Hatfields on one side and McCoys on the other side, and it's not just they disagree on policy or one thinks taxes should be this much more or that much lower. It's really a fundamentally different set of visions or understanding or definitions of what is good policy. And so I think, what is the common good? There's not one accepted view of that. That you could start off by saying there's two, but there are also divisions within each party. For instance, in Minnesota, I think there's a very stark difference between the legislators in the metro area and the legislators from greater Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I think that divide, for instance, splits the Democratic Party. Not quite as much as the partisan divide, but it's very profound, and it leads to different views about transportation, about a whole host of issues.
Light rail or busing, yeah. So back in May, you gave a talk, I think it was down in Northfield, where you said that Trump is not unelectable. You were raising that as, this is an impossibility. What did you see that others didn't?
Well, I gave that talk, and then I was asked to write a piece for the Star Tribune, which I did. And I laid out a series of developments and themes that were apparent to me in the spring. And most of them have come into, really played themselves out. One was the fact that even though Donald Trump had policy views and behaved in a certain way that voters might find an unfavorable way, mm-hmm. they were drawn to him because he was articulating this deep distrust in government. He was talking about the rigging of a system which many Minnesotans and Americans thought were favoring a few special interests over the general good of the country. Mm-hmm. And then we also saw this deep partisan divide. And this was at a time when many commentators were talking about how Republicans were going to abandon the Republican Party. And this is not the way politics are organized today. Mm-hmm. We are really tribal. We've got the Hatfields and McCoys, and the idea that the McCoys were not going to rally around one of their kinfolk, just not realistic. And then I also, I talked about the ways in which Donald Trump had kind of rallied different factions. Mm-hmm. And we did talk about the advantage that Hillary Clinton had among women, but was really striking to me how little attention was given to the gaps that Donald Trump had created, gaps among advantages among men, among whites, among voters who did not have a college education, among Americans who lived in rural areas. I mean, these were all large gaps, and it still amazes me that up through the election, there was so much media time and attention on kind of the gaps that favored Hillary Clinton, and just a lack of appreciation for how Donald Trump was connecting with the rest of the country. Connections that we learned last night in the exit polls that really overrode the disquiet that people had with Donald Trump's personal behavior. People were willing to look past his comments about women, his comments about Muslims, and say, yeah, I don't really agree with that. But these other issues I really care much more strongly about.
Well, so you're talking about all the division that we're experiencing by age, race, gender, ethnicity. How will all of these divides impact policymaking, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be something that's with us for decades and decades. And I don't think it goes away. I think it's something that's managed. If it's managed competently, it won't derail our political process. But, you know, frankly, just having observed the Capitol here in St. Paul and Washington, D.C., what I'm seeing is that the politics of division dominates. We've seen in Minnesota just over the last, few governing cycles, government shutdown, near government shutdown, failure to pass a bonding bill, which never really happens. I think the stalemate on health reform is another sad example of the inability of legislators to disagree but still find a compromise. Compromise now is equated with betrayal. Last year I had a program with one of the leaders of the Libertarian Party here and a prominent Republican. And the comment of the Libertarian was, the problem with the Republican Party is they sit down at the table to bargain, they get a deal, and government grows. And that's not a bargain that this Libertarian was willing to accept.
Right.
There are a lot of conservative Republicans who have that perspective, and then there are quite liberal folks who are unwilling to entertain the idea of compromising on views they have. For instance, MinCare, which is an important program. It's geared to those kind of just above the poverty line. And one of the proposals to strengthen MNsure is to merge those two programs, or look for ways to better coordinate them.
Yep, I've heard that.
Well, for some liberals, that is just betrayal. They're not willing to even entertain possibilities that would allow MNsure to become more stable and more helpful to more Minnesotans. So there is this kind of a line in the sand that I'm not going to cross that. And that makes it very hard to bridge these divides that are part of our life and I think will deepen in the coming years.
One last question. We've had two recent presidential elections now where one candidate has won the popular vote and the other candidate has won the Electoral College. What about that Electoral College? So our forefathers created it? Has its time passed?
This is one of those kind of adult conversations because there's something that's deeply unsettling about a president being elected who loses the popular vote. And when you explain this to folks from other countries, particularly in Western Europe, they just don't get it because the popular vote there really matters. The bottom line is the barriers to constitutional change are so high and so difficult. Plus, politicians in Minnesota and other medium to small size states think the Electoral College vote actually amplifies their political power. It gives a reason for Donald Trump to pay attention to Minnesota in the closing days, whereas getting a few million votes might not do it, but those 10 Electoral College votes, he does not win without them.
Right. Dr. Jacobs, we have to stop today, but thank you so much for coming.
Good to be with you.
The day following the election, Governor Mark Dayton and House Speaker Kurt Daudt held separate press conferences. Here is a portion of what they had to say.
Minnesotans are very narrowly divided. That was clear in the vote for president. Very clear in the vote for a number of the contested congressional races. It was very clear in the vote for the Minnesota legislature. We are a closely divided electorate in Minnesota and this country. But there's a shared desire, I think, on the part of everybody for economic progress, for social harmony. And there may be a few outliers here in Minnesota and nationally who want to prey, P-R-E-Y, on our differences. But I believe that the vast, overwhelming majority of Minnesotans, regardless of who they voted for president, want to see this state and country succeed. They care deeply about this state and this nation. They care for themselves, for their children, their grandchildren. And it's incumbent on all of us as citizens now to do our part to speak out when necessary, to say we don't want any more hate rhetoric. We don't want any more hate language. We don't want any more threats against people who are rightfully here just because they're different of religion or color or nationality. That we're one Minnesota, all of us together.
And we had the right message. We talked about reducing healthcare costs, about growing our economy and creating jobs, and those are things that resonated with Minnesotans. Trump obviously was helpful to us, but I think it's important to note that our candidates outperformed Trump. In fact, we won in districts in the suburbs where Trump lost by almost 20%. We think that's because of the work that our candidates did and because of the work we did over the last 2 years in the legislature. I don't know that last night's election or the results are going to change the things that we work on and that we talk about. We're going to talk about the things that we did when we were out talking to voters and the things that we've talked about for the last 2 years. We're going to talk about making healthcare affordable for Minnesotans again and providing more access and better choices. We're going to talk about and push policies that will grow Minnesota's economy and create jobs and really help Minnesotans.
Rural Minnesota is already feeling squeezed in many ways. Loss of a younger generation, fewer businesses, and recently low crop prices. And globally, 6 or 7 agri-food businesses have provided the majority of the seeds and chemicals. Over the summer, due to proposed mergers, that number would be just 3, sparking many governments, including the U.S., and many agricultural states, including Minnesota, to express concern. I recently asked Governor Dayton about his letter to the U.S. Attorney General and Secretary Vilsack about the mergers, and this is what he said.
Minnesotans and the farm communities have always been distrustful of those large mergers because they find that the prices are kept down that they receive for their commodities, and prices consumers go up. So I don't know if every farm group, but I'm fairly certain the Farmers Union, I believe the soybean growers, and others as well have taken the same position. So I believe I'm supporting the best interest of Minnesota.
Joining me now in the studio is the DFL lead on agricultural policy in the House, Representative David Bly. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
So you wrote a letter to Governor Dayton expressing concern. Governor Dayton then wrote a letter to the U.S. Attorney General and Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack expressing concern about this tsunami of mergers. What is troubling about this?
Well, this is something that's been going on for a number of years, and what we're looking at is choices and the ability for farmers to make choices about their future, about what the kind of farming they want to do, and to be able to make a living. And among the effects have been really a disappearance of the family farm. We have fewer and fewer farmers on the land. Farmers are being forced into a certain kind of agriculture, and we're seeing the impact of that on our natural resources like our water and our soil. These companies don't necessarily care about all of that. I mean, they may say they do, but primarily they're motivated by profits. And if they can make the profits by owning the knowledge, the ability to create genetic material, the ability to create machinery that will fit into the system that they want to create, those are problems for farmers.
Well, I want to come back to a little bit of the intellectual property aspect of this in a moment. Before we go there, though, U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley has called some hearings. He has expressed concern also on these issues, and he is a Republican. Is this a bipartisan issue?
I think it is. I think it is a bipartisan issue. It's interesting to me, too, that of the two farm groups, the National Farmers Union and Farm Bureau, both have expressed great concern because they recognize that the diminishing choices that a farmer has, and the control that corporations have over this intellectual material or whatever it might be, reduces the chance that farmers can make a choice to do one kind of farming or another. And farmers have seen this happen to them over the years, and I think it raises their concern even more when they see that the possibility or the ability to make choices about the kind of farming you want to do is greatly reduced. I've heard from both farm organizations that they're very concerned about it.
Beyond the cost to the farmers, because this is a cost factor for farmers, I've also read that there's concerns for food security. I think globally, there's a loss of crop diversity. There's less choice in the marketplace. Do you share these concerns?
Oh, very much so, yes. And crop diversity, for instance, most farming in Minnesota right now is 2 crops, corn and soybeans.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with those crops, and I don't mean to criticize the use of them, but they create green ground cover for about 2 months of the year, which means the soil is brown or bare for a good portion of the year. That leaves it open to erosion, to wind and water erosion. And if you're putting chemicals onto that soil, and it washes away, it gets into our streams, it causes havoc with habitat and with downstream, as we see in Louisiana, the hypoxia, the changing oxygen levels in the water down there.
Right, and increased algae and other factors. There was an article in the Guardian magazine that comes from the UK that said that these mergers are really about controlling big data. So the intellectual property, the gene traits of these seeds that are engineered to be resistant to products such as Roundup. These are not really concepts people think about when they think about farming, are they?
Well, the more control that the corporations have over it, the less they'll be able to think about it. And one of the problems with things like Roundup is that it's engineered to take care of certain kinds of weeds. Well, weeds have a kind of what you could call a natural intelligence that work around these pesticides, and we're going to see super weeds. We're going to see them growing and causing problems for farmers. And this is true of the whole experimentation with genetic modification. Generally trying to solve a certain problem with chemistry or with engineering, and you may solve that problem for the short term, but nature has a way of responding. And I think that's a problem that they hadn't foreseen. And it also creates more problems for farmers. How do they deal with that? They're the ones on the ground that have to deal with the weeds or the super weeds. And of course, the corporation will say, we'll come up with another idea. We'll come up with another solution to that one problem, and we'll move forward and be able to take care of things. But I think what's happening is you're creating, in a sense, an artificial system that creates more profits. We see this in the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, where you have a drug, it causes you problems. Well, they have a drug for that.
Sure.
And the same thing can happen here, where those who own the system continue to make profits off them, and the farmers have fewer and fewer choices to make ends meet. And I don't want to see farming as a way of life go away. We've seen the impact that it has on small towns in rural America, and I think that's really a dangerous path to be going down.
So what can be done at the state level? What would you like to see happen?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure what we can do at the state level, except try to point it out to our federal folks that something needs to be done at the federal level. I'm less confident that something will be done with the change that we may be seeing at the federal level.
You're talking about the administrative change from the recent election?
Yeah, that's right. I really don't know what it means. And even though it may be a bipartisan issue, I've not heard President Trump-elect make any comments about it. I'm not sure he understands the implications of it. It worries me. And I'm not sure if he's going to be listening to people who also would have concerns about this. I hate to see the direction that we seem to be headed in, where the landscape is going to be changing even more, in my mind, for the worse.
On that note, we're going to stop there, but Representative Bly, thank you for coming in today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
According to the Department of Transportation, the Minnesota legislature began passing transportation laws as far back as statehood. The ways in which we travel throughout our state have changed significantly since 1858. Horses and carriages have been replaced with automobiles, buses, trains, and even planes. How the state pays for maintaining those modes of transportation has gradually evolved to fit the modern world. Producer John Brune details the transportation funding process in Minnesota.
Transportation is financed in Minnesota through a series of established funds in the state treasury, some constitutionally created and some created by statute. State revenue sources are deposited into those funds, then distributed to various modes of transportation in the state.
The main fund in Minnesota that funds roads is called the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. It's so called because it collects the three main user taxes that fund roads in Minnesota and distributes them to some other funds that go to various types of roads. So the three main user taxes are the gas tax, and that is constitutionally dedicated 100% to be deposited into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The second one is the vehicle registration tax, which is again 100% constitutionally dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And the third is the motor vehicle sales tax. That one operates a little differently because only 60% of it is dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The other 40% is dedicated to a transit assistance fund to fund both metro and rural transit systems in Minnesota. So those three main user taxes flow into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund, and then there's a constitutional formula that allocates that money out of the fund to state highways and some other local roads.
Allocations from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund are dedicated by the state constitution. The first 5% is set aside and can be directed by the legislature for any of the allowable purposes under the fund. The legislature can change the areas of distribution every 6 years. Currently, the 5% set aside goes to town roads and bridges and other local turnbacks, which are former state roads being turned back to local control. The remaining 95% of the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is divided into three funds. 62% is directed into the Trunk Highway Fund. This is the main source of funding for the state highways of Minnesota.
The Trunk Highway Fund uses largely our state road construction, operations and maintenance of state highways, program delivery for construction or maintenance programs for state highways, and also the operations of the Minnesota Department of Transportation so that they can operate and fully service these highways. The legislature can also authorize trunk highway bonds, which are paid back in future years out of the Trunk Highway Fund using revenues flowing into the fund. 29% of the allocation goes to the County State Aid Highway Fund. This fund provides resources for the operation and maintenance and construction of county state aid highways, which are a collection of key roads in counties. They might have higher traffic volume, they might be regionally important to connect important centers in the county or even inter-county roads. The parameters are set in statute. The money again flows out of the County State Aid Highway Fund to particular counties by a formula set in statute. The third fund that receives revenues from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is the Municipal State Aid Street Fund. And just like the County State Aid Highway Fund, it funds certain roads in municipalities that have sort of a key importance. Again, maybe traffic counts, maybe large connector routes, things like that. Allocations are limited to those cities in Minnesota with a population of over 5,000. Historically, smaller cities under 5,000 have not had a dedicated source of revenue from state resources. Several years ago, the legislature did enact a new program, the Small Cities Assistance Program, and put in an initial funding of $12.5 million for fiscal year 2016. There was no funding for fiscal year 2017, but the program is established and there is an allocation formula in statute now for when that fund receives money. There is a formula for how the small cities receive some assistance. Otherwise, small cities are largely dependent on local assessments and property tax to fund their own roads.
The Transit Assistance Fund and the State Airports Fund provide necessary resources to keep these modes of transportation functioning.
The Transit Assistance Fund receives revenue from the motor vehicle sales tax, which is split between Metro Transit Systems and Greater Minnesota Transit Systems. It also receives revenue from sales tax and motor vehicle leases, which is dedicated only to Greater Minnesota Transit in the fund. But transit systems in Minnesota also receive general fund appropriations in their biennial transportation budget, and that goes to fund their general operations. There's a general fund appropriation made to Metropolitan Council, who oversees the Metro Transit system. The general fund appropriation for Greater Minnesota Transit Systems is made to the Department of Transportation, which operates it through agreements with local providers through their Office of Transit. The State Airports Fund receives revenues from a number of sources and is then appropriated in the biennial transportation budget to the Department of Transportation and their Office of Aeronautics to provide resources for the state's airports for operations and maintenance, for navigation aids, for airport development, maybe adding or improving a hangar, runway improvements, things like that.
Money from the federal government also plays a significant role in funding Minnesota's transportation needs. Federal dollars may flow directly into certain funds, or directly to local governments or to the Department of Transportation. Sometimes these dollars require state or local governments to match the federal contribution in order to receive the funding.
Federal funding is a large part of particularly state highway funding in Minnesota. That is a huge source of revenue for the Trunk Highway Fund in particular. Federal funds are also used to fund local roads projects, state airports projects, and transit projects in the state. Federal dollars flow into the Trunk Highway Fund directly and are used as trunk highway dollars on specific projects. And in other ways, for, say, local road projects, there might be the locals might have to put up a match and to receive some federal dollars, and that could flow directly to the locals. Some of them flow into the Department of Transportation through the state aid office. Great many airport projects also receive federal funding this way, and it's set up on a match system with what the locals put up, sometimes what the state puts up, to match the federal dollars for a specific airport project. And again, that usually flows in either to the local authority on the airport or through the MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics. When it comes to transit, the federal government is very involved in especially big projects like light rail construction currently in Minnesota. The Federal Transit Administration, when they choose a project that they're going to fund through a state, they will pay 50% of the construction cost. And in Minnesota, the rest is borne out, the remainder 50% is borne out by state funds, by local funds, and by the county's Transit Improvement Board, which is a joint powers board of several metro counties that collect a sales tax in the metro area and put toward transit projects such as light rail.
Learn more about Minnesota's transportation system by following this link.
Join us again next week as we introduce you to the state's new leaders and new members. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.